Okay, welcome everyone to the Overseas Press Club's new series of Zoom conversations with winners of our 22 annual awards. This is the fifth one that we've done. It's for the David Kaplan Award, and that's for Best TV or Video Spot News Reporting from Abroad. And it was won by a Vice News Tonight team, 3 of whom are here. And the show was Uganda Orphanage Inc. And the moderator is Terry McCarthy, and he's from the American Society of Cinematographers. He was the head judge of this award, so he knows why the story was so important and why it won the award. So over to you, Terry.
Thanks, Patricia, and welcome everyone to this webinar. I'm delighted to be joined by the Vice News crew who made this great story. We had, if I'm not mistaken, about 50 submissions, but this story really stood out. It was an extraordinary story, one that it came from out of left field, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but just it sort of revealed this enormous scam of orphanages that are being supported by money from the United States and elsewhere, and really kind of using kids, a lot of whom are not even orphans. They're kids that are taken from families who think their kids will get better education as a way of churning money. And of course, a lot of the money gets diverted, as we'll discover. But I thought I'd just introduce real quickly our panel. Joe Hill was the associate producer and the researcher who actually initially discovered this story, and we'll talk to him first about how that story happened. And he's joined by Julia Lindau, who is the producer, and Hind Hassan, who is the correspondent who went to Uganda to report the story. So maybe, Joe, if you could just tell us how you came on this story, because it's quite an interesting tale of how you actually found this story.
Yeah, of course. So it was kind of interesting. I had a colleague or a friend who was working in the region and who had been doing some really interesting reporting about like adoptions and some of the other sort of issues around like in orphanages and the way that, you know, Westerners were coming and funding them, or the way that Westerners were coming to adopt kids from Uganda. And so we started talking, and the government had basically announced that they were going to start shutting down these illegally run orphanages. So there's a new process to try and get, you know, to make your orphanage legal. But there was also these sort of raids or these operations where probation officers would show up and, you know, try and close down these ones that were legal. And so I guess it kind of started as just being interested in what those raids were, and, you know, what made an orphanage illegal versus legal, and, you know, how did they sort of distinguish those? And also, you know, how are so many people donating and sort of financially supporting illegal orphanages? And so my colleague in Uganda, Anna Cavell, like started sort of chasing down some answers from the government, and then I started sort of chasing down some answers from the foreign sort of donor side in the US. I guess the kind of development was that once we, once we started chasing this, like it ended up being a little bit, a lot of things sort of changed and unfolded on the ground. We sort of set out to just be on one of these raids and understand what that was, but it just became really complicated as we found, you know, like we weren't sure what would happen to the kids when they were released, or like if there was an orphanage raided and closed, what would happen to those kids? And we started learning about, there was just like a lot of things that ended up sort of coming out through this investigation that really made the story what it was.
So then Julia and Hind, you went to Uganda and you started to report the story. The story, as you produced it, starts with a very creepy sequence of well, I guess of on-the-fly interviews with this one Canadian gentleman who is in some position of authority in one of the orphanages. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that made you feel about the way this whole orphanage industry, as you've been terming it, is sort of run? Julia, you want to jump in there?
Sure. Or did you want to start, Hind?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, basically we stumbled upon this orphanage last minute, trying to find another example of foreigners who were in country supporting and volunteering at places. We actually found this orphanage on Google Maps. And as soon as we arrived, we had an uneasy feeling because we didn't know what to expect, obviously. And we saw this man who didn't appear like what we expected and encountered other volunteers to be, which is younger, do-gooder, oftentimes missionary type people who come to Uganda to work with children. And I actually saw him kind of scolding the people who run the orphanage for letting us come. But as soon as we went inside, we realized that something was off. The way, he interacted with the children, held the children, the way the kids kind of almost went, didn't really react to him touching them or picking them up. It was an extremely uncomfortable and eerie experience. And I think Hind can talk a little more about, her direct interactions with him when she interviewed him.
Yeah, Hind, talk to us about that, because one of the things that made your story stand out from all of the entries for this award was quite clearly a lot of the reporting was done very spontaneously. You clearly hadn't planned for this, and yet you ran with it. I'm wondering what was running through your mind as you're sitting next to this creepy guy and you're trying to work out what's going on in this weird orphanage.
Well, actually, before we got to this orphanage, I think we were all a bit tired and struggling at that point, because we'd come out after Joe had done a lot of research. We knew that something had existed. We knew that there were these orphanages that were being run illegally and that had children there that weren't orphans, and that was being run illegally. But a couple of the orphanages that we'd checked out originally didn't really fit the bill completely. And so it was a lot of hard work by Julia and the team that was working on it at the time to try and find one of these orphanages, because obviously a lot of them are off the grid. So you won't find them on a website, you won't find them on Facebook or social media. And so we had to contact a lot of people and word of mouth. And then, as Julia says, she found this one that was located on Google Maps as an orphanage, and she gave them a call, and we'd called a lot of orphanages and we had some leads, but some of them didn't want to be filmed or were very suspicious of journalists coming around. And then she convinced us to go, after we'd been working a lot of hours, many days, and we were all a bit cranky and not wanting to go out and film that evening, but she convinced us to go along. And it was the two DOPs that were with us, as well as the translator and the driver, and Zach Caldwell and Daniel Bateman. And when we got there, it was in the evening, and we just saw a man stood at the door that we didn't expect to look the way that he did. In my head, I envisaged someone, who was traveling and younger and perhaps trying to, do some charity work. So he didn't fit the bill, but regardless, what really shocked us was also the state of the orphanage as you walk in, as you drive in, the children that were there, and the way that he was interacting with the children. And there were a lot of things that just struck us very, very quickly, that this doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel that this is how children should be looked after in these orphanages. And so the two directors of photography, Zach and Dan, they just got their cameras rolling straight away, and we just decided to do a lot of the filming just as we went along. And some of the conversations that are in that top piece is just me having a conversation with him, and then Dan and Zach will just join in and start filming and rolling. And obviously he was well aware that he was being filmed, but he just continued and engaged with us, surprisingly. And there's a lot of things that didn't actually make it into the piece. So, how the children were sleeping, where they were sleeping. And yeah, we were all incredibly disturbed by what we saw. And we weren't really expecting to see what we saw.
So the sequences you shot with this guy, which lead off your piece, perfectly establish this mood of creepy. It's kind of almost like a Hitchcock movie. You know something weird is going on, but you don't know what it is. And that's I thought that was brilliant in the way you framed your piece.